The Goat-Foot God. By Dion. The Goat-Foot God. Thus spoke the voice of destiny, calling across the Ionian Sea. Great Pan is dead, is dead. Lowly lies the horned head. Closed is the portal that hath no key. Desolate are the valleys of Arcady, enchained by the Iron Age, bereft of his sylvan heritage. Heavy laden is the heart of man, severed from fleet-footed Pan. Wearily he bears his chain, until the goat god returns again. Partly man and partly beast, Pan is supreme, Pan is least. Pan is the whole, and the whole is Pan. Seek him within every man. With swift goat hoof and shaggy thigh, follow him to Arcady. He shall awaken the living dead. With cloven hoof and horned head, human heart and human intellect, Pan the goat god returns again. Half a beast and half a man, Pan is the whole, and the whole is Pan. Return, O goat god, return again, from the right of Pan. Chapter 1. The Funeral and the Bookseller. The double doors of 98 Pelham Street opened to the latchkey of their proprietor, who, judging by his attire, had recently returned from a funeral. The butler, advancing into the outer hall to receive him and relieve him of his meticulously rolled umbrella, his silk top hat with its deep mourning band, and his tailored black overcoat, strove to imbue his countenance with the precise measure of condolence and respectful sympathy. Hugh Potton crossed the spacious inner hall to enter his study, closed the door behind him, and poured himself a libation from the spirit's cabinet. He stood in sore need of such fortification. He sank into a capacious armchair beside the hearth, extending his feet toward the electric grate. The soles of his footwear, damp with cemetery clay, commenced to smolder with steam, yet he paid them no heed. He had but recently returned from the obsequies of his wife, who had perished in a motor-car accident. The vehicle had been consumed by conflagration. Furthermore, the proprietor of the Red Lion Hotel, near whose gates the tragedy transpired, had identified the remains as those of a Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, whom he knew well as frequent guests over several years. Nevertheless, an inscription within the timepiece discovered upon the gentleman identified him as Trevor Wilmot, one of Hugh Paston's closest companions, while an engraving inside the woman's nuptial ring identified her indisputably as Hugh Paston's wife. What demeanor befitted a husband simultaneously betrayed and bereaved? Ought it to be one of sorrow and absolution, or of abhorrent repudiation? Of this, Hugh Potton was entirely uncertain. The clandestine affair had undeniably persisted for a significant duration. Indeed, if the innkeeper's chronology were credited, it must have commenced during the very infancy of their union. Had her marriage to him proved a disenchanting experience for Frida? He sighed. To the best of his knowledge, he had neglected no duty nor spared any effort. Yet manifestly he had failed to suffice. He likened Trevor and Frida to Tristan and Isolde, and abandoned further speculation. He rose abruptly. Of one thing he was certain: he could no longer remain within the house. He would embark upon a walk, and, once fatigue overtook him, seek lodging at some hotel, whence he could summon his valet by telephone to deliver his effects. He stepped swiftly into the hall, closed the heavy outer doors without a sound, and set forth at a rapid pace toward the north. Yet, by the time he had traversed Oxford Street and was navigating that lesser imitation of Mayfair situated beyond it, his stride had faltered. He had secured very little sustenance or repose since the inquest, a deprivation that inevitably exhausts a man's fortitude. Weary of his northward course, and perceiving that the neighborhood was growing increasingly squalid, he turned sharply to the right. In an instant, he found himself within a narrow, winding thoroughfare of dilapidated appearance, dedicated principally to the trade of second-hand furniture and inexpensive dining establishments. He sauntered onward, his contemplation of early Victorian mantel ornaments and imitation Oriental trinkets disrupted by the pungent odors emanating from the adjacent cookshop. He paused before a second-hand bookshop, across the facade of which the legend T. Jelke's, antiquarian bookseller, was dimly discernible upon the weathered paint. The customary outdoor display tables had been withdrawn due to the heavy rain, but a receptacle of sorts remained just within the narrow vestibule that led to a semi-glazed door of a faded green hue. He began to leaf through the contents of the bin with half-hearted interest. The collection comprised mainly antiquated devotional tracts and soiled, neglected fiction. A relatively clean blue binding emerged from the jumble like a timber in a torrent, and he retrieved it with a glimmer of hope. It proved to be a worn library edition of a popular novel. Recognizing the author's name upon the spine, he knew it would possess literary merit, and the title captured his imagination. The Prisoner in the Opal. It evoked vivid imagery. He quickly located the passage from which the volume derived its title. "The affair gave me quite a new vision of the world," he read. "I saw it as a vast opal inside which I stood, an opal luminously opaque, so that I was dimly aware of another world outside mine." There was a singular allure in the cadence of the prose, and he read on, startled and enthralled by an account of a black mass celebrated by an apostate priest and a depraved woman. Here was a subject that would undoubtedly command his attention and stimulate his intellect. He opened the soiled green door and entered, holding his discovery. The shop was shrouded in obscurity, save for the meager illumination from the street lamp that penetrated the gaps between the volumes arrayed in the window. The distinctive scent of antiquarian books hung heavy in the air. Yet, through this mustiness, there drifted delicate whispers of another fragrance, aromatic, pungent, and sweet. It was not incense, or at least not of the ecclesiastical variety, nor did it resemble incense sticks or aromatic pastilles. It possessed elements of all three, alongside some further component that eluded his recognition. It was exceedingly subtle, as though the draught from the opening door had dislodged faint currents of the perfume where they lay concealed within the crevices of the bookshelves. Occurring as it did immediately after his reading concerning the Black Mass and its noxious fumes, and encountered in the dark, it affected him to an unexpected degree, and he felt, in unison with E. Mason's protagonist, as if the shell of the world might crack and some streak of light come through. He heard movement in an inner chamber. Presently, a soft, warm radiance cast a broad band across the floorboards, emanating from beneath a curtain draped over a doorless aperture between the bookshelves. A moment later, there appeared the figure of a tall, stooping gentleman clad in a dressing gown, or some similarly voluminous vestment, who parted the drapery to enter the front of the shop. The proprietor, if indeed such he was, proved to be a man of imposing yet gaunt stature, his loose garments draping slackly over his frame. His unbelted dressing gown, with its trailing cords, gave him the appearance of a monstrous bat suspended by its webbed wings in slumber. Hugh proffered the soiled blue volume. "I retrieved this from your discount bin," he remarked. The bookseller squinted at the cover. "Now, by what means did that find its way there?" he inquired, as though addressing the volume itself. "Since it was deposited in the bin, I shall charge you the corresponding sum. Yet I would never have subjected it to such indignity by choice. I hold books in high esteem." He raised his eyes abruptly, transfixing his customer with a penetrating gaze. "I possess an affection for them akin to that which others harbor for horses. Shall I wrap it for you?" "No, thank you, I shall take it as it is. Pray, do you possess any other volumes of a similar nature?" It was as though an iron shutter had descended across the bookseller's countenance. "You refer to further works by A. E. W. Mason?" "No, I refer to other works concerning the Black Massachusetts." The bookseller regarded him with suspicion, refusing to be drawn out. "I possess Huysmans down there in French. There are no volumes in English on the subject of the Black Mass, none, at least, that are worthy of the name. I do not consider mere sensationalism to constitute literature. There is nothing, to my knowledge, strictly devoted to the Black Mass, though I have one or two intriguing works on related themes. The Devil's Mistress, for instance, and The Corn King and the Spring Queen. Perhaps you might care to examine them. I have them in my possession here, if you would be so kind as to step this way." He drew aside the tattered curtain suspended in the doorless aperture between the bookcases, and Patan followed him. He found himself in a somewhat small room, whose ceiling was disproportionately high for its dimensions. What little light existed emanated from a green-shaded lamp positioned upon a small table beside an antique, leather-clad armchair drawn up to the hearth. The lamp cast a narrow circle of soft illumination upon the chair. The remainder of the chamber was shrouded in a dim, warm gloom, for the fire within the old-fashioned grate had burned low. Serge curtains hung in a careless fashion across a tall French window on the wall opposite the entrance through which they had passed, and adjacent to them stood a partially open door, revealing the corner of a sink. Heaps of dusty volumes occupied the corners of the floor. A modest kitchen table, draped in a coarse blue and white checkered tablecloth, stood in the center of the room, constituting the sole piece of furniture unencumbered by books. The fireplace beneath its white marble mantelpiece displayed exquisite wrought iron craftsmanship, featuring high hobs on either side. Upon one rested a black earthenware teapot, kept warm by the embers, whilst upon the other lay a heavy plate of willow-patterned design. Opposite the armchair, on the other side of the hearth, stood a large, leather-bound sofa with broken springs. "If you would be so good as to seat yourself," the bookseller murmured. Hugh Patan sat down, finding the seat far superior to any of the chairs in his own residence. He sank into its spacious depths and relaxed. "I fear I am delaying your evening meal," he remarked. "Not in the least," the bookseller replied. "I have not yet commenced the preparation of it. I have merely brewed some tea. Might I, offer you a cup, should you do me the honor? It would be a pity to allow it to oversteep and be wasted." Hugh Patan accepted, wishing to avoid offending his host. Even in more favorable circumstances, tea was not a beverage he customarily favored. The bookseller produced 2 large, white cups adorned with narrow gilt bands and a peculiar small gold flower at the bottom of each. Hugh recalled having observed identical vessels in the potting shed of his childhood home. He believed they had been employed for measuring herbicides and insecticides. Certainly, no human being had ever drunk from them. Into these capacious receptacles, the host poured a quantity of milk from a bottle. Granulated sugar was shoveled in with what resembled a leaden spoon, followed by a stream of rich, mahogany-colored liquid poured from the damaged spout of the black teapot. This, the bookseller remarked, presenting him with a cup, is a robust beverage for a man. It was hot, it was potent, and, in sum, it bore not the slightest resemblance to tea as it was conceived in his wife's drawing room. Hugh Potton had no way of knowing that, shortly before his arrival, the Vulturine bookseller had purchased his customary evening newspaper and discovered a photograph in which the press photographer had been fortunate enough to capture a single countenance with clarity, the face of the chief mourner at a highly sensational funeral. Gazing upon it, the old man had murmured to himself, "Poor wretch!" The elder possessed eyes of a remarkably pale, vivid blue, deeply recessed beneath prominent brow ridges resembling those of a gorilla, and overshadowed by eyebrows dense enough to serve most men as a mustache. He was clean-shaven, his tanned, leathery skin hanging about his jowls in folds, reminiscent of a bloodhound. Hugh Potton had initially estimated the man's age to be in his 80s. In truth, however, he was a weathered and dilapidated 65, appearing considerably older than necessary owing to his dressing gown, an article of attire customarily associated with the infirm. The host, for his part, observing the gentleman opposite him, estimated his age to be in the early 30s, though he suspected that regardless of his chronological years, he would never again possess a youthful aspect. He wondered whether the man had been profoundly enamored of the woman who had perished alongside her lover, and surmised that he had not. There was a hungry and restless expression upon his countenance, one not typically observed in men who have known love, even when that love has been unrequited. This was an unfulfilled individual, the bookseller reflected. Providence had granted him everything he desired, yet nothing he truly required. A deficiency of spiritual sustenance and a rachitic soul was his diagnosis. He concluded that the man possessed too much idealism to resort to alcohol, but that he would likely prove reckless and erratic in all his endeavors unless a stabilizing influence were introduced at this critical juncture. Watching his visitor intently, he noted that the guest was growing more settled and at ease. Having himself known the vicissitudes of existence, he recognized that a reaction was imminent, and that the guest would soon find himself thoroughly exhausted. He pondered what measures might be taken to sustain him through this difficult interval. "I wonder if I might offer you some supper. The hour grows late, and, though I cannot speak for you, I find myself growing hungry. Indeed, now that you mention it, so am I." The elder withdrew through the doorway adjacent to the French window, revealing to Paston's view a small, appended kitchenette, as compact as a ship's galley. The ignition of gas signaled the presence of a stove behind the door, and within moments a splendid sputtering was heard. The host returned with a second plate, which he placed to warm beside the hearth, before restoring the heavy black kettle to its position upon the hob. "Would eggs and bacon be to your liking?" he inquired. "Nothing could be better." In a remarkably brief interval, the bookseller returned bearing a heavily laden tin tray, from which he proceeded to transfer a miscellaneous assortment of items onto the table in the center of the room. Hugh Potton felt he had never in his life encountered an aroma so enticing as that of the bacon, nor beheld anything so appealing as the crisp edges of the fried eggs as his host served them directly from the pan. They commenced their meal. The older man seemed disinclined to converse, and Hugh Potton, who felt as though he had not eaten for a week, was similarly silent. They dined in obscurity of speech. At the conclusion of the repast, his host replaced the black teapot upon the hob, replenishing it from the kettle. He then piled the utensils onto the tray with a thunderous clatter and deposited the load in the kitchen, before returning to the now blazing hearth to fill his pipe. Hugh Potton was half asleep over his cigarette, his feet extended upon the fireside stool, and a cup of the highly concentrated tea resting beside him. The agonizing events of the preceding days, and indeed his entire married life with Frida, seemed to have receded into the remote backward and abysm of time. The old bookseller, observing his guest, perceived that the younger man was far more inclined to sleep than to engage in any other activity. He arose, approached the window, parted the curtain, and peered out into the darkness. Nothing was visible. Rain descended in long runnels down the glass. A fierce draught forced its way through the crevices, swaying the tassel upon the cord of an unlowered blind. "A wretched night," he remarked, letting the curtain fall back into place and returning to the hearth. Hugh Potton roused himself with some effort. "What hour is it?" "It grows late. Have you far to travel?" Hugh named a hotel with which he was acquainted. "Good heavens! What reason have you to stay there?" "Heaven knows. I could no longer endure the house, so I departed." It never occurred to him that he had disclosed neither his identity nor his history to the bookseller. Nonetheless, he assumed as a matter of course that the elder was fully acquainted with his circumstances, which indeed he was. The bookseller regarded him thoughtfully. "You cannot return there. See here, might I offer you lodging for the night? You would be most welcome." "That is exceedingly kind of you. Indeed, I should be pleased to accept." The older man took up the lamp and led the way into the shop. In one corner rose a narrow wooden staircase. They ascended 2 dusty flights of rickety stairs, whereupon his host opened a door adjacent to the bathroom. "Here you are," he said. "No vermin. I can assure you of that much, though nothing further." Left to himself, Hugh Potton took stock of his quarters. The bed was not strictly a 4-poster, yet it possessed 2 tall posts at the head from which a canopy projected. Curtains of faded crimson damask suspended from it, in keeping with the unsanitary customs of a bygone era. Hugh disrobed and slipped into the bed, which comprised an immense, plump feather mattress, half a dozen faded blankets, and a worn patchwork quilt. Upon waking, he found it was broad daylight, and his host, clad still in the same ancient dressing gown, albeit with pajamas beneath, stood observing him, holding a massive mug in his hand. "Here is some tea for you. Rise when you wish. There is no need for haste." He gestured with his hand and departed. Breakfast, Hugh reflected, was among the most delightful repasts he had ever enjoyed. The teapot, resting upon the hob, remained thoroughly hot, and they toasted bread upon forks before the glowing coals. To achieve absolute perfection, he required only a dressing gown resembling that of the elderly bookseller and a pair of carpet slippers. "Why are you doing all this for me?" The old man knitted his tufted brows at him. "God only knows," he replied. Potton laughed. "You have heard my story, I presume? I am aware of what has appeared in the press, and I can surmise the rest. There is nothing further to surmise. The newspapers published everything. The old man offered no reply. In any case, I am profoundly grateful to you. Heaven knows what I might have done had I been compelled to spend the night alone in that hotel. The bookseller rose. I have tasks to attend to, he said. Make yourself at home. There is abundant reading material. Pray do not allow the fire to extinguish. He vanished through the curtain into the shop. Left to his own devices, Hugh Potton reclined upon the sofa and settled down to his cigarette. Amidst the soiled cushions lay the volume he had purchased the previous evening. He retrieved it and began to turn its pages. Presently, the elderly bookseller completed his chores and returned to the room behind the shop. Once the postal orders had been dispatched, there remained, apparently, nothing further to occupy them for the rest of the day save to sit and await the arrival of casual patrons. Given that the weather was exceedingly inclement, such visits were highly improbable. At approximately midday, a loud pounding resounded at the door. "That is Mrs. Hull," the bookseller remarked, proceeding to admit the charwoman, who entered as impetuously as a vessel under full sail, laden with various parcels, most of which were wrapped in newsprint. The elderly bookseller handed her some loose silver from his pocket without deigning to count it, whereupon she departed with the same blustering energy. He cast the now distended black oilcloth bag onto the table, where it disgorged an extraordinary assortment of items. "Absolutely trustworthy," he observed, "and of great assistance to me. She is precisely the sort of person one requires in a household. She attends to her duties and departs immediately upon their completion." The bookseller then set about preparing a meal. There was a pound of pale pork sausages, visible through their damp greaseproof paper, and a substantial portion of mashed potato in a basin, evidently procured from the neighboring dining house and requiring only to be reheated. Hugh Potton leaned against the jamb of the door leading to the kitchenette, observing the elderly man at his culinary tasks. The frying pan presented an appealing spectacle as the pale sausages gradually browned. The old bookseller transferred them from the frying pan, and, lifting the white china basin of mashed potato, held it at arm's length and struck its base, retreating adroitly as the hot fat spluttered from the pan when the potatoes landed within it. Hugh Potton, a cigarette between his lips, was seized with silent amusement. He thought of his butler. He thought of his chef. He recalled the head waiters of fashionable establishments, and wondered what his acquaintances would make of his present circumstances. He suddenly realized that he shared a greater intimacy with this elderly bookseller than he had ever experienced with anyone in his life. He sensed that the pale blue eyes beneath their tufts of whiskers discerned far more deeply into his soul than he himself was capable of doing. His contemplations were interrupted when the large black tin tea tray was thrust into his hands. The old man loaded the meal upon it, and Hugh Potton bore the heavy burden into the sitting room. Without prompting, he filled the large black kettle and placed it upon the hob, prepared for the perpetual tea. He reflected that the elderly bookseller, with his teapot and frying pan, his sofa of broken springs and his misshapen feather bed, had preserved his sanity and guided him safely through a period of crisis. By what means this had been accomplished he could not fathom. The bookseller dined rapidly, and the repast concluded with a slice of moist sultana cake and tea. Potton hoped to engage in a prolonged conversation, when the elderly man abruptly placed 2 soiled volumes in his hands, saying, "Amuse yourself with these. I invariably sleep at this hour, and suiting the action to the word, he reclined in his chair, opened his mouth, and fell asleep immediately. Hugh Patton, unable to drift into slumber so easily, composed himself to examine the volumes he had been given. They were the works the bookseller had previously recommended. The Devil's Mistress by Brodie Innes, who was a writer to the Signet, whatever that might be, and The Corn King and the Spring Queen by Naomi Mitch Eisen, a narrative of ancient Sparta. He sampled the latter volume first, reading the opening chapter concerning the sorcery of the Scythian witch. Having acquired some knowledge of indigenous magic during his expeditions on safari, he understood the formidable power of autosuggestion upon the primitive mind. It was singular, indeed, to discover the same manner of witchcraft in modern Africa and ancient Scythia. He settled to read attentively the account of the rites of spring plowing. The dim, comfortable room vanished from his sight as he envisioned the woman lying nude in the center of the vast field, gazing at the small white vernal clouds in the sky above, and feeling the chill wind and the spring sun upon her bare skin while the slow, snow-white oxen dragged the primitive plow ever closer as they circled the field. He read further, but the fate of the Spartan royal house held less appeal for him. Consequently, he set the book aside and turned to the other. This was a narrative of an entirely different character, based upon the records of witch trials in the state papers of Scotland. The ancient incantation, "Horse, haddock to horse and away," delighted him. It possessed an authentic resonance. He smiled at the image of the handsome, spirited Isabel Gowdy placing a broomstick in bed beside her dull, tedious husband before stealing away to the coven in the old churchyard to carouse with the devil. He wondered what prompted respectable, sober Scottish matrons and maidens to cast off restraint and rebel so thoroughly. He could comprehend their indulging in the local equivalent of nocturnal revelry. But why this adoration of the devil? Whence came the religious element in these practices? He laughed softly to himself at the notion of some respectable burgher portraying the devil, complete with bovine horns, 2 upon his head and 1 in his hand. His laughter was sufficiently loud to awaken the elderly bookseller. "Humph," said Jelkes. "You stick to sausages." Yet, despite his ostensible slumber, the old man had been reflecting deeply. Having guided Hugh Patton to safety in the midst of the tempest, it was not in his nature to remain passive and observe him recede once more into deep waters. Still, what was to be done with the man? To invite him to extend his sojourn would, he reasoned, constitute a tactical error. Patton belonged to an entirely different sphere. He might be sufficiently content to camp for a night or 2 upon an old feather mattress, but he would scarcely care to prolong such an existence. No, Hugh Patton must be returned to his own world on Monday. Yet what would befall him then? There was something fundamentally amiss with the man. It was far more profound, originating much earlier than his wife's defection. He wondered what inner emotional history lay behind Hugh Patton. Powerful undercurrents were rendering the surface so turbulent, and their owner was the last person to comprehend their nature. They prepared tea. Hugh Patton attempted to calculate the number of cups they had already consumed between them that day, but failed utterly. The storm had returned and was sheeting down against the window, which was tightly shut against it, and his cigarettes, Jelkes' pipe, and the blazing hearth combined to produce a most comfortable atmosphere of heavy warmth, wherein the soul was liberated to traverse the heights of fancy while the body reclined, too enervated for movement. "Well?" inquired the elderly bookseller. So you have read the volumes, have you? And what do you make of them? Do not attempt to persuade me that they celebrated the Black Mass in Calvinistic Scotland. They would not have known how. No, precisely. Huysmans demonstrates that clearly. One must employ a fully ordained priest for such an undertaking. Yet one can obtain the liturgy anywhere. It is contained entirely within the prayer book. There is far more to it than the mere words. Are you aware that it requires a year after ordination for a priest to learn to celebrate Mass? I speak from experience. I was very nearly ordained myself, having been educated by the Jesuits. At what did you hesitate? Were you unable to reconcile yourself to the faith? I could reconcile myself to the faith readily enough. It was the humility that I could not master. Patan regarded the craggy, vulture-like elder, and believed him. Could you celebrate the Black Mass? Were you so inclined? Should I desire to do so, yes. I possess sufficient knowledge for that purpose. But I have no such desire. Then you were indeed ordained? No, I never progressed so far as that. Yet one could not remain on the inside of affairs, as I did within the seminary, without acquiring a great deal, provided one kept one's eyes open. I witnessed much then which I only came to understand in later years. What is your estimation of the Jesuits, if that is not an indiscreet question? I consider them the most marvelously disciplined body of men in the world, and the most formidable should one oppose them. I believe they commit certain fundamental errors, yet I admire them. They instructed me thoroughly in the power of the disciplined mind. Is that what accounts for the efficacy when a priest celebrates Mass? Yes, that, and the immense momentum of the Church itself supporting him. That is why the Roman Catholic Mass possesses a potency that the Anglo-Catholic ceremony lacks. The Church of England does not know how to train its clergy. Then it is not merely a matter of theology? No, it is a matter of psychology, in my estimation at least, though that constitutes rank heresy according to all established authorities. Tell me, Jelkes, would you perform the Black Mass for me, merely as an amusement? No, you utter fool, I will not. It is far too perilous. But you have just asserted that it is merely psychology. Perhaps. But have you considered what forces you might arouse within yourself? There is nothing within my knowledge that I deem sacred. Huysmans' variety of the Black Mass would hold no allure for me. But let us be frank, Jelkes. You continually dangle the carrot before the donkey's nose, and I respond to it, yet as soon as I attempt to grasp it, you withdraw it. Well, what is it that you desire? Confound it all! I do not know. But I desire something, of that I am entirely certain. Do you yearn for that which lies beyond the horizon, where untraveled roads descend? No, Patan remarked, suddenly contemplative. And therein lies my difficulty, I believe. There are no pathways in my life, not even unfamiliar ones. It would be preferable for me to embrace devil worship than to have nothing at all. Jelkes displayed his camel-like grimace. We may be able to arrange something rather better for you than devil worship, he said. Who constitutes we? Patan inquired quickly. The bookseller dismissed the query with a wave of his hand. You have still not informed me what it is about these volumes that attracts you. The scent of sulphur, I believe, if you desire the candid truth. Well, there are times when civilized men, and women too for that matter, require sulfur precisely as horses require salt. It was that very necessity which drove the Bacchantes to dance with Dionysus upon the mountains and rend fawns asunder. Have you ever read the Bacchae, T.J.? Yes. Euripides understood that man cannot live by bread alone. He requires a modicum of sulfur occasionally. That may have been acceptable for the Greeks, but were I to ascend to happy Hampstead, divest myself of my garments, and rend a leg of mutton to pieces, there would certainly be trouble with the authorities. Yes, the old bookseller agreed sorrowfully, gazing contemplatively into the hearth. I fear there would. The Black Mass is a species of departure from convention. It is a reaction, my son, a reaction to an excess of the true Massachusetts. Can one truly suffer from an excess of that? One can suffer an excess of anything sufficiently potent to be medicinal. Ingest too great a quantity of medicinal salts and observe the result. T.J. You are a dreadful old pagan. I am a comfortable old pagan, my young friend, and I offer thanks to God for it. Well, I too am a pagan, T.J. But I am far from comfortable. When were you last happy, Hugh? It is remarkable that you should pose that question, as it is one I have been asking myself. Indeed, I can scarcely remember. I have known precious little happiness in my life, and yet I suppose I have possessed everything a man could desire. I have always seemed, as it were, to make the best of circumstances and endure them with as much philosophy as I could muster. Was your marriage happy until its dissolution? Yes, indeed. Frida was the exemplary wife. I found no fault in her until the inquest. And yet you do not give the impression of having been particularly devoted to her. In truth, I was and I was not. I remained loyal to her, and we coexisted harmoniously. We never exchanged a discordant word. She had always appeared perfectly contented. Yet the marriage could not have satisfied her. Otherwise she would not have strayed, would she? Was she coerced into the marriage against her inclinations? Or did you win her hand on the rebound from another? Hugh Patton sat gazing into the fire, his extinguished cigarette resting between his lips. At length, he removed it and remarked, "Are you aware who introduced me to Frida and virtually orchestrated the marriage? It was her cousin, Trevor Wilmot, the very individual with whom she subsequently conducted her affair." Jelkes elevated his prominent eyebrows. Was it indeed? So that was the stratagem. I cannot say. It never occurred to me that there was any stratagem. Trevor was my closest companion at university, and when we came down, we were both rather at a loose end. He was unable to secure employment, while I had nothing to do but exist in inherited affluence. And what transpired thereafter? You believe, then, that I was married for my fortune. It would appear so to me. Silence descended upon the somber room as it darkened into twilight. The fire burned low, yet the elderly bookseller made no move to replenish the coal. Ultimately, Patton broke the silence. But why did Trevor exert himself so greatly to arrange that marriage? Have you ever read a novel by Henry James entitled The Wings of a Dove? No, what is its subject? A man and a woman are in love, but lack the means to marry. They mutually arrange that the man shall marry a wealthy woman who is dying of consumption. Hugh Patton remained silent for a time. Yes, I suppose that is the explanation. he murmured at length. I suppose I was the milch cow that financed their liaison. Good heavens, what a world! I think I shall go out for a walk. It is raining torrentially. It is of no consequence. I require some air. Chapter 2. Planning the Pagan Temple. Initially, Hugh Potton walked aimlessly through the dark streets, grateful for the cool, damp, rain-washed air after the oppressive heat of the room behind the shop. The revelation to which the elderly bookseller had guided him had undoubtedly been a profound shock. He recognized that the old man had effectively lanced the abscess upon his soul, which should now have an opportunity to heal. Nevertheless, he harbored no delusion that he was entirely clear of his troubles. He disliked his own internal state. He still felt unnatural. He wondered whether the elderly bookseller had arrived upon the scene too late to afford him any genuine assistance. Had he but known, the old man whom he had left in the close, oppressive room behind the shop was contemplating precisely the same question, and felt a profound unease regarding the consequences of his experimentation with human souls. It is one thing to have comprehended the theory of psychoanalysis, but quite another to apply it in practice. In a short while, Hugh Potton ceased his aimless wandering and set out resolutely toward his residence. The distance was not formidable, and his long strides bore him swiftly over the pavement of the deserted streets. Upon arriving there, he admitted himself with his latchkey into the darkened hall. At the end of the corridor was a swinging door. Passing through this, he found himself upon the back stairs. Descending a short flight, he came to a door on the half-landing, beneath which a line of light was visible. He knocked, and a woman's voice, marked by a slight Scottish accent, bade him enter. He entered a small room, excessively crowded with ornaments, and a short, stoutly built woman with graying hair rose to greet him. "Good evening, Mr. Potton," he said. "Sit down, Mrs. Mackintosh." And she complied, still in silence, observing him questioningly. "Mrs. Mackintosh," he said, "I am going to relinquish this house." She nodded, expressing no surprise. "I wish you to discharge the servants, providing them all with 3 months' wages. It is through no fault of theirs that the establishment is closing. Remove everything from my bedroom and pack it into trunks, all my personal effects, I desire none of the furniture. Extract all my papers from my desk and place them into deed boxes, and consign the entire lot to storage. Thereafter, place the house in the hands of the agents and instruct them to conduct an auction of everything, lock, stock, and barrel." "What of Mrs. Paston's things?" Hugh Paston's face twitched. "Sell them as well." "But what of her papers, Mr. Potton?" Hugh sat in silence for a long time, the woman watching him with pitying eyes. Finally he spoke. "Yes, those must be dealt with, but I cannot do so now. Cannot be done. Look here, you must place them all into deed boxes and store them along with the rest of the goods. But keep them separate from my papers, you understand." "Very well, Mr. Potton," said the housekeeper quietly. "You may rely on me." "Thank you, yes, I know I can," he said, and rising abruptly to his feet, he wrung her hand and was out of the front door before she had finished rubbing her tingling fingers. Although it was past closing time when he returned to Billing Street, he found the shop illuminated, and the half-glass door yielded to his pressure. At the first chime of the bell, the old bookseller emerged through the serge curtain. for the more he pondered the way his guest had received things, the more anxious he had become. Hugh Potton followed him into the room behind the shop, cast his hat upon the table, and sank into his accustomed seat on the sofa. His action reassured the old man, for he could see he felt at home. "Well," he said, "I have done the deed." "What deed?" cried Jelkes aghast, wondering if a murder had been committed. "Given orders for the servants to be paid off and the house sold. I have disposed of everything except my personal attire. Oh yes, and my wife's papers. Those must be tackled sometime, but not now." The old man heaved a sigh of relief. "Well," he remarked, "I surmise you have earned your supper." "Yes," said Hugh Potton, "I suppose I have." The frying pan and teapot were brought into action, and the amicable, silent meal was partaken of and cleared away. Yet, although relieved concerning his immediate anxiety, for his guest had neither blown out his own brains nor anyone else's, the old bookseller did not like his appearance at all. His hopelessness and apathy had given place to a species of repressed excitement that struck the old man as being far from wholesome, and as likely to lead to rash acts, the consequences of which might have to be paid for dearly. It was not easy for Jelkes to comprehend the viewpoint of this man, sitting silently smoking on his dilapidated sofa. He was of a different class and tradition, of another generation, and of a totally different temperament. Jelkes' mother had been left a widow in straitened circumstances, and though she was not a Catholic, she had solved the problem of his education by sending him to the inexpensive yet excellent school in the neighborhood run by Jesuit fathers. She was assured that no attempt would be made to convert the boy, and was satisfied with that assurance. No attempt had been made, but among the teachers was, as always, a man of marked charm of character, and to him the lad became deeply attached. No attempt needed to be made to convert that boy. He came knocking at the door of the fold of his own accord. And not only did he enter the fold, but he aspired to the priesthood. He felt he had a vocation, and the highly experienced men who judge such matters also thought he had a vocation. But he had been claimed too late. A robust and rugged character had begun to form before he reached the seminary. The playing fields of his preparatory school had done their work. He could not reconcile himself to the whispering, the influence, and the routine humiliations. He bowed his neck to the yoke in the first flush of his faith, but presently he asked to be released. His friend came and pleaded with him, and not only pleaded with him, but wept over him, wringing his hands in despair. The entire experience made a terrible and searing impression on the adolescent youth. He had not taken the actual vows, being still in his novitiate, but the most stringent admonitions of chastity had been impressed upon him. These, together with his friend's heartbroken revelations of feeling, had prevented him from ever looking upon a woman with love. A priest at heart, he had passed through life in complete spiritual isolation. A mystic by temperament, he was denied all spiritual consolation by his analytical brain. Penniless, without any qualifications, he had by great good fortune obtained a position as assistant to a second-hand bookseller, found the trade congenial, and developed an aptitude for it, for he was a youth of well above average capacity, as his teachers at the seminary had perceived. Spending nothing on female companions, nor seeking to make himself attractive to the feminine eye, he saved steadily, and by the time he was 40, had established a shop of his own. He soon prospered sufficiently to satisfy his simple needs, and these being satisfied, declined to exert himself any further, but enjoyed life after his own fashion, which consisted in a pot of tea on the hob, his toes on the fender, a book in his hand, and a collection of the curious literature that interested him. He had encountered a translation of Iamblichus' curious work on the Egyptian mysteries. This, supervening upon what he already knew of the method of St. Ignatius, afforded him a revelation that was little less than a second conversion, for he perceived in a sudden flash that he had glimpsed the key to the technique of higher consciousness. This served to launch him once more upon the ancient quest, the search for the light that never shone on land or sea. He had suddenly attained the knowledge that there existed another kind of mysticism in the world beside Christian mysticism. Ever since then, he had pursued strange byways of thought, following up every bold speculation in science, every new viewpoint in philosophy. The search for the absolute took hold of the untidy scholar among his dusty books, and kept him serene and contented as the years slipped by, bringing him neither fame nor fortune but only the merest pittance, for he did not choose to exert himself. He had received a sound grounding in scholarship among the Jesuits, was familiar with the classical languages, and possessed a working knowledge of Hebrew. Consequently, he was able to go to the fountainhead of most subjects, Sanskrit alone excepted. Yet, however much gratification he might derive from his intellectual engagements with the Absolute, he recognized that offering this particular sustenance to Hugh Paton in his current condition, or, indeed, in any state, would be of little avail. Paton was a man who had been starved of life's essence, one who had languished in the midst of abundance without ever comprehending the nature of his affliction. He felt a sense of relief upon observing that his guest, having settled his more urgent concerns, appeared entirely satisfied to partake of the humble fare prepared in the frying pan and to entertain himself by perusing the bookshelves. He observed his guest's browsing, aware that this pursuit would provide the most reliable insight into the man's character, and noted with interest the armful of vintage volumes he carried over to the sofa and with which he settled himself. He perceived that Paton had retrieved the treasured work of Iamblichus, an odd volume of Madame Blavatsky, and, most incongruously of all, another book by Huysmans, Against Nature. Jelkes watched him shift his attention from one volume to another, and back again. He surmised that Paton had selected Against Nature due to his interest in Huysmans' other work, and he was surprised to see him settle down to read it in earnest. Hours elapsed. The elderly bookseller prepared a fresh infusion of tea to serve as an evening draught, placing a cup beside his guest's elbow unperceived. Hugh Paton looked up abruptly. "I have discovered my Bible, Jelkes," he declared. "Good heavens," remarked the elderly bookseller. "Your preference in sacred texts is remarkable. Were you my son, you would find yourself placed face downwards across my knee. You are no longer a child, Hugh Paton. Surely your literary tastes are more mature than that. Come, now, you would scarcely characterize Against Nature as a juvenile book, would you? I would characterize it as the book of a callow adolescent. Anyone who has reached years of discretion should find it utterly distasteful. But can you conceive of a synthesis of Down There and Against Nature, with a tincture of Iamblichus and Ignatius? I can, though I should much prefer not to do so. It is not as objectionable as it might seem. Allow me to explain it in this manner. I must furnish some manner of residence. I intend to do so in the style of Huysmans, not because I am truly degenerate, like his esteemed Des Esseintes, but because it amuses me and provides an occupation for my hands and mind. Now, suppose I were to furnish my dwelling in the manner of iamblicos. That is to say, I establish a composition of place with the intention of establishing contact with the ancient pagan deities, and then express this concept through the furnishings? Suppose. Do you want access to this and all the complete audiobooks on the channel, plus the ebook version? Click the link in the description or scan the QR code in the left corner of the screen to access our library, where you can listen to your favorite esoteric books without ad interruptions, lock your screen, or use other apps while the narration plays, and even download the ebook version to follow along as you listen. Listen on your computer via web browser, or download the app from the Play Store. After subscribing, you will receive an email with your login details, password, and step-by-step instructions on how to access the books through the Hotmart app.